Dr. Mara Merlino. I am an Associate Professor of Psychology and Sociology up in the Behavioral and Social Sciences Division, one floor up is my office. And I have been teaching at Kentucky State University since 1999. This is my 5th year here at Kentucky State University. I came to Kentucky State University from the University of Nevada at Reno, and my degree is in interdisciplinary social psychology, which means that I am trained to teach in either psychology or sociology, and my area of expertise within that broad field of social psychology is law and social science and the justice system. So my research, I'm not an attorney, but my research involves trying to have an understanding of how the justice system works in our country. So this research is part of an ongoing project that we have been doing in the Behavioral and Social Sciences Lab now for quite some time. We've just completed a new wave of data collection. We have not analyzed those data yet, but we do have a new wave of data collection, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as we discuss our topic here. So as you can see, today we're going to be talking about gender justice and attributions of culpability and how that affects the severity of sentences received by male versus female defendants in the legal system. All right, for the students in the room, I'm going to take an opportunity to make this a teachable moment. When you're doing a presentation or a paper, you always want to start off with an introduction or a statement of the problem, and so that's what we're discussing here. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, published in 2006, we do tend to see a couple of disparities with respect to what happens when men and women are adjudicated, or in other words, they enter the legal system. And there's a large body of research that actually talks about this idea that men versus women are treated a little bit differently. So, for example, if a person actually enters the legal system, and I need my glasses to look at my notes. We tend to find disparities like the ones that you see up there. For example, in cases where men and women are adjudicated for murder or non-negligent manslaughter, 94% of men as opposed to 84% of women who committed those murders or non-negligent manslaughters were sentenced to prison. So about 10% difference in terms of who gets sentenced to prison. 64% of men versus 48% of women who committed sexual assault were sentenced to prison. So I guess maybe, sexual assault's not so bad if you're a woman, in some people's view. Further justice statistics report that 71% of men versus 52% of women who commit robbery are sentenced to prison, and 45% of men versus 27% of women are sentenced to prison for aggravated assault. So clearly there's something going on here. But the question is, what exactly is it? Why is it that men and women receive different sentences for doing the same types of crime? And this has been an ongoing question that recently, or somewhat recently, has gained a little bit more attention since 1997. We had several women who actually were executed back in the late 1990s. Some of you remember Carla Faye Tucker, who was the young woman who committed axe murders and then became very religious while she was in prison. And so there was a big movement by certain groups to commute her death sentence, have her resentenced to life in prison as opposed to executed. And there were several women. Eileen Wuornos, who was the subject of the movie Monster, was executed at about that time, and also another woman named Sante Kimes faced execution at that time for some kind of Black Widow type killings. Black Widow killings are where you marry people and then you kill them and you take their money. kinds of things. So those high-profile cases really sort of have increased interest in this issue of whether or not women are in fact being treated more leniently than men in the justice system. With respect to the length of the sentence that men and women get, even if women tend to be sentenced to prison, they serve less time for the crimes in some instances. However, across the border in the state of Pennsylvania, women have in some cases been sentenced to longer periods of time, not because they deserved more time behind bars, but because Pennsylvania didn't have a separate facility for women, and so rather than sentencing them sending them to a facility where they would get out sooner, they simply sentenced them to longer prison sentences so that they could warehouse them. So there have been these instances of disparate treatment with respect to who's getting what kinds of sentences in court. Some additional information about length of sentence for those robberies: 71 months for women versus 105 months for men. That's a fairly substantial difference. 54 months for women versus 64 months for men for aggravated assault. So what's going on here is the big question that we're talking about. Okay, that's a statement of the problem. We have something out here that we need to understand. There are several explanations for why it is that we may see these gender disparities. And among them are the idea that there are some biological tendencies that women have that are different from the biological tendencies of men. And so we need to treat them a little bit differently. Biological tendencies, those theories include the idea that women are more impulsive and emotional than men, and they're less able to fully intend their own actions. So we're reactive, we don't premeditate as much. Additional types of explanations for female offenders are psychological tendencies. Women tend to be, stereotypically, they tend to be docile and passive. So as opposed to active and assertive or aggressive, which are characteristics that are more what we believe men to be. Okay? And so offending in females, rather than being this person is really kind of an evil Bonnie Parker character, is more a cry for help or a psychological disturbance. Women commit crimes because they're abnormal and crazy, in other words. A third kind of explanation for offending, if you are looking at the difference between males and females, is this idea that women are treated differently because of the deviance from their cultural norms. Now this one actually kind of works in the reverse to those ideas that women are passive and crazy. From this point of view, if women deviate from those cultural norms, they actually are seen as more deviant than men who do the same kinds of things, and so they get sentenced more harshly because they are more deviant. So, these ideas may influence the outcomes of sentencing for men and women in prison. One of the more popular ideas out there is this idea of the chivalry or the paternalism hypothesis. We have a long history of this chivalry/paternalism in the court system. Women weren't allowed to go to law school because they weren't supposed to be in court and be exposed to all those ugly, nasty things. You know, we're the tender sex, we're the gentle sex, and so we should be protected from the ugliness of human nature. And so women can't be lawyers because that's exactly what they expose themselves to in the courts. Additionally, women, there are judges out there. If you ask judges what's going on here, some judges will actually tell you, I can't sentence an older woman to a harsh penalty because she's somebody's mother, or that little girl is somebody's sister or daughter, and we tend to think that we need to treat women more tenderly than we do men. Okay? So, problematic women harshly punished, the problematic women being the ones that deviate from the norms, of course, than are women who follow along more traditional gender behavior. So it's against the background of this really long history of seeing men and women being treated differently in the courts that really led us to where we are today and to ask these research questions that we're asking. And I'll just read those to you. These are more words on the slide than I like to put typically, but I'll go ahead and read them out to you. The first question is, against what standard of behavior are female and male defendants' behaviors compared? Are we comparing them to women, male to female, social to psychological? What are the standards that we're looking at? The second question is, do observers' views of the gender appropriateness of a defendant's actions reflect their evaluations of whether the actions are due to internal characteristics or the characteristics of the situation? Out in the social psychology literature, there's this thing called the fundamental attribution error. And simply stated, that means that when we observe the behaviors of others, we tend to view that behavior as due to some internal characteristic of that individual. It's a trait that that individual has, as opposed to due to the situation that the individual is in. So, is it something inherent within the individual? We as observers tend to go in that direction, so it's a cognitive bias. The other side of that is when we are acting ourselves and we explain or justify our behavior, we tend to come up with external causes, especially if the behavior is negative. Somebody made me do it, or it happened because you did this to me, as opposed to, I did this to myself. So, to what extent do those factors contribute? And finally, how can these views be reflected in the severity of sentence that participants choose for male versus female offenders? So those are some of the questions that we are addressing with the research that we've got. Our method is a scenario study. Scenario study is a kind of a survey that you do where you lay out a case scenario in this instance. And our case scenario actually described the facts of a murder case, a true murder case from the state of California that it's been decided some time ago now, but the defendants in the case were found guilty, and they were now entering into the sentencing portion of the trial. So the scenario actually explains the case facts, and it talks about what's referred to as aggravating and mitigating factors for, to influence the sentences. Now, an aggravating factor is any factor that tends to make the crime worse than it actually is. And among and these vary state by state depending on the justice system. So aggravating factors could be something like for example, one of them here is the brutality of the crime. Was torture involved? Was the murder committed against a child or an elderly person or a police officer in the line of duty? Those are factors was it committed in the course of a burglary? All those are factors that are considered aggravating factors because it makes the crime worse. Premeditation is another aggravating factor that we see. So mitigating factors are those factors that actually extenuate or make the crime seem less bad than it actually is. For example, an extenuating circumstance might be when a battered woman kills her batterer, and she says, "Judge, he was coming for me. I believed that his intent was to kill me, and so it was self-defense." That would be an extenuating circumstance. There's no question that the person did the crime, but under the circumstances, it was justifiable and understandable that the person responded in that way. Okay. Participants in the study Presently, we've got 113 students at Kentucky State University who participated in this so far in our new wave of data collection. We also have some community members that participated in our survey, so we'll be adding a community-based sample. Of the persons who participated, 31 were male, 82 were female. We had 89 who were black, 22 white, and 1 Middle Eastern participant who self-identified as Middle Eastern. So I talked a little bit about our instrument, the scenario-based method where we presented the facts of the case, the aggravating and mitigating circumstances. I'm going to go in a little more with what those aggravators and mitigators were. But it was, we've done 2 waves of data collection. So one of them was a paper and pencil-based wave of data collection. The next one we put up on SurveyMonkey. So we've got a little bit of a methodological difference there. But essentially it's the same survey, just distributed in different modalities. Within this data collection, we actually had 8 different conditions that we were looking at. So for students in the room, a condition, when we talk about a condition, we're talking about independent variables. Remember that your independent variable is the variable that the experimenter controls or manipulates. And so we can change the values of that, and we can compare the groups based on those changes in value. So 8 different conditions in which we varied the sex and the race of the offenders and the sex and the race of the victim as well. Here we are reporting strictly on gender differences. So we're not going to talk about race, although we did find some interesting effects with respect to those race and gender issues. I'll talk about that in just a minute very briefly. So we had 8 different conditions where we had either a male defendant or a female defendant. That male defendant could be black or white. The female defendant could also be black or white. Same thing for the victim. Okay, we had male victims, we had female victims, we had male victims who were black or white, we had female victims who were black or white. So that's how we came up with our 8 different conditions. So the scenario described the facts surrounding the murder case, the aggravators and the mitigators, and then we asked our participants to come up with a sentence. Now, in California, once you get a sentence of murder, and these guys were actually convicted of murder, there are 2 possible sentences for murder. One, you get life without parole, or you get the death penalty in California. We added a condition where students could actually choose to do a lesser sentence if they wanted to. And then we asked them to give us a length of sentence so that we could have a numerical measure of how bad they thought the crime was. How many years do you think a person ought to sit in jail for doing this crime if you choose not to have them in a life sentence? Okay. In addition to our aggravating and mitigating circumstances, we also asked our participants to complete what's called the bisexual inventory in reference to the defendant. So if the defendant was male, if the defendant was female, the bisexual inventory actually is a list of descriptors. It's 60 items long. There are 20 distractor descriptors in this instrument. So, words that could apply to either males or females, like happy or cheerful or something like that. And then there are 20 items that are considered to be female-typed items and 20 items that are considered to be male-typed items. So, for example, a female-typed item could be emotional or passive, where a male-typed item could be assertive or aggressive or takes control. So there are sort of active versus passive descriptors out there in the sexual inventory. So we wanted to see, based on the participants' ideas that they gathered about the defendant based on the scenario that they read, where those defendants ranked in terms of their masculine versus their feminine typed behaviors. So we had them do that as well, and then as another exercise, we had them fill out what's called a locus of control scale, which simply means that a locus of control scale measures whether or not you think that you are in charge of your outcomes, or that, or you are a victim of fate and circumstance. So a person high in locus of control says, yes, I can control my behaviors, I am in charge of what I do. A person who is low, conversely, does not feel that. Yes, ma'am?
I'm sorry, they're doing this locus of control for the defendant?
For themselves.
Or for themselves?
Yeah, we want to know what they think about themselves. You know, because there may be an issue where, you know, if I am low in locus of control and I think that, you know, stuff happens a lot by chance, then it might influence the way that you decide based on the scenario that we've got here. And in fact, we did not find that to be pervasive on the locus of control. So these are the aggravating factors that were considered in the study. The case scenario was this, these two defendants brutally murdered by beating to death with, basically beating to death with a hammer, the spouse of one of the spouse of the ex-spouse of one of the defendants. Okay, so say for example it was the male defendant case. It would be the two male defendants breaking in, and in the course of committing a burglary, the new husband comes home, and so they beat the husband to death with a hammer, took his stuff, and went out the door. Okay, they're convicted of this. They've already been found guilty. So the next question is, what do we do with them? So the attorneys present this set of aggravating and mitigating factors in order to make their cases. So the aggravators, the things that make the crime worse, are the defendants had been talking about it in advance. Yeah, we're going to go, and I really want to kill this guy. I'm really angry and upset with this guy, so we want to kill him. The brutality of the crime, it takes a little bit of hatred to pound somebody's head in with a hammer, when you think about it. And so the crime was exceptionally brutal. Handcuffs were involved. Okay. The defendant had a history of drug abuse, used drugs in the past, and in fact, one of the mitigating factors they're arguing is that drugs were involved, and the guy, in terms of the intent to commit the crime, that was just drug talk. They were on drugs and just talking out loud. Defendant had a history of violent behavior, and in fact, the violent behavior that was perpetrated on the victim was the same kind of violence that this individual had done before. The younger of the two, the son or daughter of the father, had actually victimized and pretty severely beaten up an old lady, and talked about it. So another one of the aggravating factors is the victim impact. The victim said, this was our father, we loved him, or our mother, we loved her, good person, we've lost a member of our family. We want this person to get the death penalty. We want the most severe penalty we can get for this person. So those were some of the things that made the crime worse. Our mitigating factors, they were arguing that there was no advanced plan to kill. They planned to go in and commit this burglary and take the stuff, but there was no plan to commit murder at that time. What happened was that the victim came home while this was going on, and they argued that they were surprised and afraid when the victim came home. And so, things just got out of hand. So that was one of the mitigators that they were arguing. Another thing that they argued was that when the victim, or when the child victim, or the son or daughter defendant, I should say, was around the father, who was the co-defendant, the personality of the child changed because the father had been abusive in the past. And so the offspring was afraid of the father and therefore under the control of the the father. The defendant was there, but really the crime that was committed was committed by the father. And so the defendant's, the son or daughter's participation in the crime was actually minimal compared to the contribution of the father. That's an important thing to know when you have co-defendants in a murder who actually pulled the trigger, who actually did the killing, because it changes the outcome. Defendant had some younger siblings who the father used to abuse. Father was abusive, and so as the oldest child, the two younger ones were protected by the older child, and so they will suffer and miss their older sibling very much if they're put to death. More factors. We talked a little bit about the victim's unexpected return home. The son had been, or daughter had been in prison before the defendant had, and had demonstrated that they wouldn't be a threat or could adapt well to the prison population, and taking them off the streets and just putting them in prison is going to remove their threat from society generally. Also, if the kid's not around the parent, then they're still young enough to change their behavior. So there is some hope of rehabilitation. Father was abusive. We talked about that before. The father tended to, the assault that was done on him was the same kind of thing that the father tended to do in the past. And finally, the father is a real sweetheart of a guy, as you're starting to get the idea. Regularly used meth with the kids. So, giving all of our participants the opportunity to review these facts and to weigh them carefully in their consideration, we then ask them to assign a sentence, either death penalty, life without parole, or a lesser sentence, and whatever that is. The analyses that we have done on these, because we have one of the problems that we've got is that we've got a small cell size in there on one of these things. And so the analyses are fairly straightforward analyses. And so we've done these, what's called a factorial ANOVA for the students of the room. And factorial ANOVA is simply you have a couple of independent variables. Remember, independent variables are what you manipulate. So in our case, we were looking at the sex of the defendant, so whether the defendant was male or female. And we were looking at, that's one variable. Okay. The other variable you see listed there in the row across the top are our three conditions for sentencing. So is it death penalty, is it life without parole, or is it a lesser sentence? And then we looked at, we asked people to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being none, all 5 being extremely, how much weight or how impactful each of these different aggravating or mitigating factors were with respect to their final decision. And so we did a series of analyses. Now down there's a little notes to what's the magic number I put in each of these cells with a question mark next to it. Those of you who've been in statistics, ideally how many participants would we want in each cell?
Is it 20 or more?
20 or more, so that really the magic number is 30. Statistically speaking, when you have close to 30 participants, the distribution along the numbers starts to closely approximate the normal distribution. So we try to get 30 people, 20 people is fairly marginal. And in one of these cells we have a lot fewer than that. So you have to kind of take that into consideration, and that's why we want to gather more data. So in the analyses we have to recognize that. So we had 113, ideally we have 30 in each cell. How many do we need? 90, 90, and 90? There's 30, 30, and 60, 60, and 60. The way I counted up, 180. So we still need to get some more data in order to strengthen our analysis. found was really interesting. We did not find any findings, we did not have any statistically significant differences for defendant sex. So whether you were male, whether the defendant was identified as male or female, didn't make a difference. So what in the world is going on here? We did get differences with respect to sentencing. So what's going on? So here's some of the stuff that we found. Statistically significant, although we didn't have a gender effect or defendant sex effect, male versus female, we did find with respect to how they were evaluating the manipulations that there were some factors that weighed in more heavily than others with respect to whether or not you were getting a severe sentence. So of all the things that you see up here on this little graph, technically this should be a line chart for the students. Because these are continuous data as opposed to categorical data. But I wanted to put them all together on a chart so that you can see very quickly what the deal was. Okay. Of the factors that were the most impactful, brutality was the thing that mattered the most. And there were statistically significant differences among all three levels of the variables. So over here you see that the blue bar represents the people who gave impact and chose the death penalty. These are the people who measured the impact and chose life without parole. And the green people are the people who chose the lesser sentence. So each of these different colored bars represents a different group of participants. And they're sorted out by the kind of sentence that they chose. So what this says is that for the people who chose the death penalty, that was really the most impactful. This is a statistically significant difference from life without parole, that step down. There's also a step down from the red bar down to the green bar. That one was not statistically significant. So the big difference comes between death penalty and life without, and the lesser sentence, although these two were statistically significantly different. Of these, the only statistically significant difference that we didn't get was here, with respect to the character of the victim. For our participants, okay, the guy's a good guy, and he's going to be missed and all that stuff, but not so impactful. Still made a difference, but not so impactful. So those are the aggravating circumstances. Here are our mitigating factors. And among the mitigating factors, I have full papers here. Okay. These are all statistically significant differences. All statistically significantly different. As you can see, these are the people who chose the lesser sentence. So they wouldn't even put that person in jail for life. They're going to put them in and they're going to give them a chance to get out on parole. But they're going to make them serve a prison sentence of someone. Come on in. No, okay. Not a problem. So with respect to these, you can see in some cases the bars are almost equal. So not a statistically significant difference here with the death penalty and the life in prison fees. But we've got people who are saying, okay, the defendant has the opportunity to change, and this made a really big difference to me in terms of the impact of that sentence. So we did have some statistically significant differences. The remainder of these, fewer significant differences here. Sorry, I actually had to make myself some fairly extensive notes here. Okay. Among these, this one was not statistically significantly different. any differences there, but we did find statistically significant differences among the others. Okay, here, again, here's no difference between those folks who are choosing life without parole and death. Very little difference here. But in other areas, we do see quite a bit of difference. Dr. Brown?
So the data seems to reinforce my preconceived notion that if you give a harsher sentence, you are weighing the aggravating factors much more in your mind. Am I misinterpreting the data?
I don't think that I would make that kind of an interpretation, because while we didn't see sex of defendant effects, we did see masculinity and femininity effects. So it's a little more complicated than that. It depends on the defendant. We know on the basis of research that, go ahead.
But this data that we're seeing right now doesn't have that masculinity, femininity split.
No.
At the moment.
These are just the raw data, and collapsed because we did not have that. We didn't show that gender effect. But when we get over here, next slide, okay, here's where we begin to see something. Okay. What's the story here? Well, we asked people, what's the story here? In addition to the instruments that they filled out, the different scales that they filled out, we actually asked people to talk about why they did what they did. Not only how much did this influence you, but how did it influence you? So you described to me what you were thinking when you, say for example, the brutality of the crime. If you rank that a 5, why is that? Why did you do it that way? And we heard some pretty interesting things with respect to our qualitative data. So it's always a good idea when you're doing this kind of work to let qualitative data inform the quantitative data, because we can tell on the basis of the numbers what they ranked, but we can't really get inside people's minds unless we ask them what they're doing. And so here's basically what we heard. First, I want you to take note of this really interesting tick right here, because what that says is that women who were sentenced to death were viewed to have more masculine characteristics than were the women who were not sentenced to death. Wow. This is not a statistically significant difference, but only just not. I think the p-value on this is 0.052, so we're trending in that direction. Can't call it statistically significant. But this finding right here suggests that we may have that problematic woman effect going on. She's seen as more deviant, more masculine than are the men who did the same crime. The only thing that we varied in these scenarios was the sex of the defendant and the sex of the victim. It's all the same information otherwise, so we held everything else constant. So, what this means, high scores on this indicate high values of masculinity. The lower scores are more feminine type, is the way that the scale works out. So, more masculine typed behavior over here. A little bit less in life without parole. I'm tending to view you as a little less masculine typed, although this number is still very high. By the time you get down to the lesser sentence down there, you see that that just sort of falls off a cliff with respect to the women. Stays fairly high and constant when the defendant is designated to be male. So, what's the story here? What does this mean for our legal system, and what does this seem to imply? Well, given the information that we've had based on our qualitative data, what seems to be going on here is that women are in fact being held less accountable than are men when it comes to being able to say to that father, no, I will not people were really, not very willing to allow that 25-year-old male defendant to claim that I was intimidated by and afraid of my father. Therefore, I went along with what my father wanted to do. Women, on the other hand, that was a more plausible kind of a mitigator for women. And so we saw that effect playing out here. Pretty interesting stuff. Now, I mentioned that I was going to get to that little thing that we found with respect to race. And because there's not a lot of diversity in our sample yet, we need to get a little more diversity in there to see if we actually have an effect here. But what we found with respect to race, when we were varying the race of the defendant, was a trend that moved toward, guess who, if the defendant was black or white, guess who got the higher sentence? Guess who got the death penalty? Anybody? The white male. It was the white male. And that white male was especially in trouble if our participant happened to be a black female. Because the black females blew that measurement off the chart. So we need more participants, we need more diversity in the sample before we can actually say anything about that would be statistically significant. But it really is a very counterintuitive finding. Now, another thing that we wanted to know, just to make sure that we were all on the same page for this thing, was whether or not you considered the death penalty or life without parole to be a worse sentence. And there are people out there who think it's a lot worse to send somebody to prison for life than it is to execute them. Because then you have to sit in prison all your life and think about it and live that life, and you suffer longer if you've got life without parole. The other side of that is that there are also those people out there who think that life without parole is in fact a lesser sentence, that it's a more lenient sentence than the death penalty. So we wanted to look at that and just see who thought which one was the lesser sentence. Okay. Clearly, you know, in most instances, yeah, the death penalty is a worse sentence, but those were things that we needed to uncover as well. Finally, by masculinity and femininity score, here are the data that suggest to us that some of these things are being viewed differently. These are bivariate correlations. Again, we didn't have that many numbers, so we couldn't get any too fancy with our analyses. So these are just bivariate correlations. What's a correlation study, students?
Study of how something relates to another. How one factor relates to another factor?
Yeah. So there's a mathematical relationship, and our correlation just simply demonstrates numerically the strength of that relationship, where if you move the level of one, the level of the other variable will vary as well. So what we see here are some positive and negative correlations. The ones on the top are positive correlations. So what that means is that as the level of one goes up, the level of the other goes up as well. Okay, if you increase the level of one, you increase the level of the other. So we did this with our impact scores and our masculinity and femininity scores, and we correlated those two things to see how related they are. And here are the statistically significant ones that we found. Correlation between the brutality of the crime, as the brutality level went up, there's the influence factor went up on that one. Masculinity went up as well. High masculinity, high impact of that brutality factor. Okay. The physical abuse factor also positively correlated. So, as the impact of the physical abuse increased, masculinity increased as well. And then we have a series of negative correlations here, whereas the level of one went up, the level of the other one went down. Chris's personality changed when he was around his father. When Chris was away from his father, he was less violent, less aggressive, or she, as the case was. When they're around the father, they change. As the level of masculinity increases, the level of impact that factor had decreased. Okay. Stating that the other way around, as you know, the lower you are in masculinity, or in other words, the more feminine type your behavior, the higher that factor weighed in. Okay. Same thing with these things down below, all negative correlations. So Chris is young enough to change if Chris is away from the father's domination. Chris being a gender neutral name that we used, of course. So if Chris is away from the father's domination, Chris could be rehabilitated. The idea that Chris's father tended to be violent and therefore invoked more fear in the defendant played out, weighed in more if you were more feminine type than masculine type. And finally, the victim suffered the same type of assault that in the past that the father had perpetrated against the child, also had a negative relationship. So the lower your masculinity score on that one, the higher the impact of that one. So problems with the study this is called the humility section for the students. So you always, when you're doing presentation of this kind, you always talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of your data. So here are some of our study limitations. I mentioned one before. We had a small cell size in one of those conditions, and so we need more data to increase the power of our instruments so that we can actually determine whether we have some significant findings. We need more diversity in our sample, okay, predominantly African American Black students who are in the sample, and we also, it's always stronger if you can take your study out into the community and not use the student population. So we would like to go there as well and get some more community eligible people. It's a scenario study, and there's an argument out there that scenario studies are a step away from the reality of the courtroom. And so they don't, in some cases, don't generalize well to what actually goes on in the courtroom. So that's a kind of a criticism that we have on this kind of a study. So in future, we want to continue with our data collection. And in fact, like I mentioned before, we've done that. And one of the important things that we want to look at with that data collection is that we've got a pre-post kind of a thing going on here. And smack in the middle of that falls Trayvon Martin. So when we actually did our data collection last fall, it was just shortly after Trayvon Martin had been decided. And so we might see some changes with respect to that very high publicity case and how willing people are to be more harsh with respect to those racial disparities that we saw, or less harsh as the case may be. Greater diversity we talked about, jury eligible community participants, and finally, maybe doing some additional scenarios, so branching out from murder cases and actually looking at some of those other crimes like robbery or aggravated assault or the property crimes might yield some different findings. There's my information. You should always put your contact information at the end. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes?
Okay. Externality, which is the part of the locus of control measure used, that does correlate significantly with Machiavellianism and narcissism, and probably psychopathology. It's all part of the dark triad. And the dark triad has been expanded by one professor to include sadism as well. And so these could be complicating variables for your study.
Absolutely. And how do you have any information about how those would relate, say, to like the Big Five or or other personality measures that we've got out there?
No, I'd have to go back on that. I can't say. The big five, I guess we should identify what the big five is, and I use ocean or openness to experience,
Yeah.
and that would be probably negatively correlated with the dark triad.
Yeah.
And then there's conscientiousness, and that too would probably be negatively correlated with the dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychology. And then we have extroversion, there wouldn't be much of a correlation. The agreeableness dimension, though, could be affected by that. And then, of course, the neuroticism dimension
Yeah.
would probably correlate with the psychopathology dimension, but I'm not sure how much complicating variables are, but maybe the students can use the online open online Big Five measure. I've had my students do that. But see, the thing is that externality may have increased along with Machiavellianism, and the narcissism dimension we know has increased over the past 30 years. An interesting thing is that Machiavellianism, there was at least one study that showed it used to be males were more Machiavellian than females amongst college students, but now there was one study where females actually surpassed male students. So that's a trend. It'd be fascinating to see
Yes.
older Americans versus younger Americans.
Yeah, and that's why it's really important to go outside of the college community for the students in the room. For those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with some of the terms that we're tossing around here, Machiavellianism is the idea that that the ends justify the means, kind of, and so Machiavellianism is a way of looking at what's going on around you and exploiting those circumstances. And Machiavellianism can be good or bad. I mean, there are two different ways of looking at that. But basically, it's this idea that you are really kind of at heart a schemer and willing to exploit the circumstances around you to reach your own ends. So there are a variety of different characteristics or personality traits that we can talk about that may be tied in to what's going on here, and certainly that muddies the water, but it would be a really good idea if those traits were, you could administer those instruments separately, or if they are correlated with those subscales on the Big Five, which is a very popular personality measure for the students in the room who haven't been there yet. Sure, you could look at looking at the Big Five and then breaking it out that way as well. It would just be a matter of trying to figure out whether or not it would be beneficial to go with something like the Big Five as opposed to doing each of those measures separately. Because you always want to make sure that you're measuring what you say you're measuring when you're doing a study like this. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Dr. Brown.
I was kind of curious how heavy-handed you were in reinforcing the defendant's gender. Was it various references in the text of him and her, or was there a picture provided?
No, a picture. It was Chris he or Chris she.
And that's it.
Anytime, yeah, that's the only distinction that we made, was it was either Chris he or Chris she. And we did manage to come up with some interesting stuff on the basis of that, which of course may change as we get more data, but preliminarily these are what we have found. So that's a good question. Anybody else have any questions or comments or thoughts about the research? Yes.
You talked about there's no significant differences between the female and male in first analysis, analysis, but afterwards you said about that in their different factors you can see significant differences. So differences?
What we can say is that there are differences, not in whether or not we named that person male or female per se, but there does seem to be a difference with respect to what our role expectations for males or role expectations for females are. And so that, rather than saying it's because they're male or because they're female, we could say instead that it's because they behave more male or behave more female. And that seems to be what we were seeing on that previous direction. On that slide right there. Because
And I was a little bit confused that in the first column there's no significant differences, but you describe some reasons explaining that it's something that should be different, like female is more like in a sentence to death than the male.
yeah, and it was not a statistically significant difference. And that's the important thing. It has not yet reached statistically significance. If we set a level, a cutoff level, at what we call statistically significant at 0.05, and we get a finding that is 0.052. Okay. You're really nudging up against that statistically significant thing, and we can say that we trend in that direction. But we're not quite there yet, so you have to be very, very careful about how you state your findings when you have something like this. Yeah, we can see it, and on that slide, as you can see, the females land a little bit higher than the males, but we need more data. And with the effect of the more data, we may either see that female level drop below the level of males, or we may see that increase. We may see a change in some way. So that's why I can't say that there was a statistically significant finding, but I can say that we are seeing something there. Just we haven't reached that level yet. Okay? Other questions? Oh, okay. Everybody, thank you so much for braving the snow and coming. I really appreciate your being here, and thank you for your interest in the research. Come to the lab if you want to be part of doing these kinds of studies. We can find stuff for you to do. So come on up to the lab, and thanks for coming.